This might sound crazy to some of you that are younger than me, but back in my day, it used to snow. Like, a lot. Pretty much every winter we'd get multiple foot snowstorms, and it'd remain cold enough that the snow wouldn't really melt until spring. I swear, I remember one year we got like 4 feet of snow, and we were out of school for 2 weeks straight. And I used to walk to school, uphill, both ways. Because there was like a valley in the middle, so no matter which way you're going, you had to go down and then up. It's fine. I had a bike. And I also had one of those weird like skateboard things with 3 wheels that wasn't a skateboard, and it had like a button in the middle that you had to step on, and like if you fall off of it, when I fell off of it, it would like stop itself. I don't know what it's called. If I find a picture of it, if I figure out what it is, I'll put it. Anyway, it used to start as early as October. Sometimes there'd be snow on Halloween, and of course in November. And because there was so much snow, we used to be able to make forts out of it. Not danky little pits, mind you. I mean cartoonishly lavish igloos with tunnel systems and hidden foxholes. We had trenches for snowfire warfare, and our snowmen sentries stood guard until the ice in their veins ran warm by the approaching Easter heat. You could arrange the whole neighborhood to play, building imposing encampments in the plowed snow pits and exchange fire across the street from each other. If you had friends. I mean, I didn't, so I don't know, but it's what I've heard. As I got older, winter got warmer. Every year. I've seen the climate change in my lifetime. Now we get occasional inches of snow, followed immediately by either freezing rain encasing it in shells of ice, or warmer rain turning it into slush. This episode's about climate change. I know. But I planned for this before the election. Besides, this was always going to be the starting point. The climate crisis is the greatest threat to humanity, short of nuclear. We're going to get back to that, I promise. The March episode is going to be all about it. That's the plan. I read How Democracies Die, How to Be a Digital Revolutionary. I'm reading the Anti-Fascist Handbook. I've got this cool American history book, The 1619 Project, The Order. I watched the Alt-Right Playbook. I went to that protest on the 5th. I didn't go to the one on the 17th because I was sick. We're going to talk about it next episode. First, let's talk about bias. Bias is one of those nebulous base words that you kind of just have to know what it means. The definition of bias evokes partiality, whose definition evokes bias. Describing something as biased usually has explicitly negative connotations, which sometimes I feel undermines its true nature. Try to think about ancient humans surviving in an immensely complicated natural world.
Humans 50,000 years ago were survival specialists. They had a detailed mental map of their territory, their senses were fine-tuned to the environment, they knew and memorized a great amount of information about plants and animals.
Have you ever wondered how ancient humans made use, like mechanically how they made use of their exceptional cognitive abilities? It gets a little chicken and egg when you wonder about the development of our minds and the development of less complex language, but focus for now on like a time pre-verbal communication, pre-written language, maybe even pre-generational knowledge building. There's a more low-level, non-community driven advantage to having such massive headspace that comes into play long before any of that. One that satisfyingly explains trauma, pattern seeking, prejudice, but also learning. Bias is an immensely useful survival tool, informing decision-making from past experience without the need for conscious interpretation, or even specifically recalling those past experiences, by continuously shaping thought patterns around them as they're being challenged or reinforced. Bias emerges out of the foundations of cognition, and human minds are machines of bias. Just to be clear, I don't mean human minds are predisposed to bias. I mean the mechanics that drive bias are foundational to cognition. When you read a chemistry textbook, and then read another, read over the lecture notes the teacher gave you, review those concepts ahead of the next semester, and then reaffirm those concepts through application in the next level class, and then are asked a specific question about chemistry, one that you can answer accurately but can't recall the exact paragraphs in the exact textbooks you read, the information you used to get that level of understanding. That's it. Your brain shaped your thoughts around the concepts as you were interacting with them until it could independently spit out accurate results. This is what AI is trying to mimic, and that's why AI can't be trusted to make decisions. Feed it a bunch of American criminal justice data, and it'll start recommending longer prison sentences for black-sounding names. Feed it a bunch of American hiring data, and it'll start rejecting black-sounding names. Yeah, that was a good guess. It's just another bias engine. Critical thinking is the pursuit of objectivity and truth through comprehensive analysis. Definitionally, this should include acknowledgement of the influence of bias for the purpose of mitigating its influence on the conclusions. Despite the vibes you might get from debate bros, critical thinking is an innate attribute or obtainable condition. It's a practicable skill set, and the application of critical thinking skills is never a passive process. Critical thinking is kind of the antithesis of bias. Where bias leads you to conclusions you can use to navigate the world without understanding it, critical thinking enables you to navigate the world through understanding. The scientific process is the practical application of critical thinking skills in building knowledge. Science is the process of experimentally challenging hypothesized explanations describing the behavior of natural phenomena. A phenomenon is some form of observable event. That's an intentionally broad statement. From the formation of stars, the occurrence of lightning, interactions between subatomic particles, even to patterns that emerge within theoretical frameworks described by consistent rules. Think like imaginary numbers and other mathematical constructs. The natural world is driven by rules that, as far as we can tell, are perfectly internally consistent, out of which complexity is an emergent property. In the scientific process, the phenomena is what? A hypothesis is a proposed explanation for why a phenomena occurs, against which data gained from experimentation can either support or challenge, to prove or disprove it. The phenomena is what, and the hypothesis proposes why. A scientific experiment is designed to determine the accuracy of a hypothesis. It's a rigid procedure where variables under test are modified across iterations, and everything else is controlled to be constant to determine the effect the modifications of the variables had on the results of the process. The variables to be modified are informed by the hypothesis under test, and the results should either support or challenge the hypothesis. As a side note, some scientific experiments are designed to test against multiple hypotheses simultaneously, all proposing mutually exclusive explanations for the same phenomenon. And results from experimentation can also be inconclusive rather than explicitly in affirmation of or in contrast with the hypothesis. A scientific report is an article explaining the execution of an experiment. It'll usually have specific sections: the abstract, a high-level, often closer to plain English summary of the experiment and its results, the methods section explaining how the experiment was conducted, the results section speaks for itself, and the conclusions or discussions doing things like expanding on the results with context. Falsifiability is an important attribute of a hypothesis. Here's an excerpt from Mooncat's nearly 3.5-hour long fucking masterpiece on the pseudoscientific nature of evolutionary psychology.
The very definition of a just so story is something that's untestable, and the very nature of evolutionary psychology renders all hypotheses essentially untestable, because your hypotheses will include the contention that we evolved the trait that we're testing. That bit is the just so story because you literally can't prove it.
The hypotheses of the field propose to explain why humans evolved specific psychological traits, but a hypothesis like this can't be disproven. The moment you start to unpack the hypothesis, you realize none of this makes any fucking sense, because the question of what purpose the trait serves, that it was present in ancient humans, and that it evolved at all rather than being a learned behavior is all basically assumed in the hypothesis. There's literally no data that can be collected through that lens that conclusively disproves it, because it's been engineered out by all those assumptions. If a hypothesis is engineered such that the only possible results of experimentation are in affirmation of the hypothesis or inconclusive, it's called unfalsifiable. And that makes it a much less useful tool in building knowledge, because if you can't disprove it, there's no means of differentiating results in affirmation of it from coincidence. The null hypothesis is the negation of the hypothesis under test, the assertion that the hypothesis is incorrect, that the correlation is incorrect, the effect not present, whatever the hypothesis proposes. If conclusive experimental results don't support a falsifiable hypothesis, you could also describe that as having it proved the null hypothesis. A scientific theory is a hypothesis that's been repeatedly supported by the results of scientific experimentation, an accurate explanation of a phenomenon. The word theory in science has a definition distinct and fundamentally incompatible with the general colloquial definition of the word. When you hear someone refer to a scientific theory as if it's synonymous with assumption, guess, or proposition, they're either ignorant to the scientific nomenclature, or they're intentionally trying to misinform you. A scientific law is a logical or mathematical statement that acts as a description of the behavior of a phenomena. The phenomena is what, the theory why, and the law is how, like how it behaves. It's a prediction of behavior. Laws are the most rigid and concrete expressions of the predictive power of scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge is the living body of scientific laws and theories, supported by experimental data and continuously subject to scrutiny, experimental repetition, and expansions by the addition of new hypotheses being confirmed or rejected by the results of new experimentation. With all that in mind, when someone tells you that something can't be understood through the application of the scientific process, what they're really telling you is that it doesn't stand up to the application of critical thinking skills. The scientific process is the practical application of critical thinking skills in building knowledge. Science is the only responsible tool for building knowledge and factually informing decision making. Because the global climate is a complex system, in order to gain understanding of it through the application of the scientific process, there's an immense amount of science that needs to be done. Data collection, experimentation, statistical analysis, literally all over the globe through atmospheric conditions, ecosystems, fossil records, all types of shit. It's more than any one person or group can reasonably conduct on their own. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is humanity's greatest composite effort to study the global climate system. They release reports with the conclusions based on the results of tens of thousands of publicly available peer-reviewed scientific articles. If you really dig into the studies, you can see the vastness and the variety of methods used. I'm going to list a few that caught my attention, but take it with a grain of salt because I'm not a climate scientist, and I just did my best to understand their methods sections. In this one, scientists measured the concentration of an acid in ice cores produced by oxidation of a byproduct of phytoplankton blooms driven by the melting of ice sheets they live in correlation with the age of the samples determined by well-established analysis of their isotopic and chemical composition, and validated by cross-reference against available satellite measurements since the 1980s to estimate the fluctuation of Antarctic sea ice across thousands of years. This one analyzed global precipitation patterns from the 80s to the mid-2000s by land, island, oceanic, and satellite measurements from all over the world. Scientists also measured the atmospheric CO2 concentration in Antarctic ice cores and correlated them with climatic events that occurred during the last ice age to establish its relationship with the events. Then in another report, determined a connection between a sudden increase in the concentration of atmospheric CO2 measured in ice core samples and a rapid increase in Antarctic temperatures indicated by chemical analysis. Scientists in this report analyzed the concentration of certain boron isotopes in the fossilized remains of single-celled organisms found in areas where oceanic CO2 would have been in equilibrium with atmospheric CO2. And since the concentration of those isotopes is informed by the pH of the water, which is dependent on the concentration of CO2, they were able to reconstruct the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 to like about 40 million years into the past. Now I have to come clean. I pulled a sneaky on you. And I bet you didn't notice. I bamboozled you. Those articles I just listed are only 5 of the 36 studies on the first page of the 40 pages of references to scientific studies just for Chapter 2 of Working Group 1's 2,400-page IPCC 6th Assessment Report on Climate Change. IPCC 6th Assessment Report. 6th Assessment Report. 6th Assessment. That document alone makes reference to 14,000 publications, and it's only the first of multiple reports focusing on physical science where the other two tackle impacts and mitigation. Saying that 90% of scientists agree that the climate is changing and that change is driven by human emissions is kind of misleading. It's true, but it's not the point. No amount of belief makes something a fact. Like I said, science is the only responsible tool for building knowledge and factually informing decision-making. Those less than 3% of scientists, we'll get to those fuckers later, may have a handful of fraudulent studies or facts that they decontextualize and misrepresent, but the rest of them made this. In fact, they made 5 of these. I said before, this is the 6th assessment report. 6th assessment report. 6th assessment. For all that variety in methodology and focus, the accumulation of results composes an inescapable conclusion. The opening sentence of the report reads, "It is unequivocal that human activities have heated our climate." So if anyone tries to tell you that the science behind climate change still isn't settled, I want you to go print out a physical copy of this report with a laser jet on standard printer paper, 2-sided, and beat them over the head with it. I want you to use all 23 pounds of arcane knowledge laser dusted in mystic pictographs in Latin runes across the composite tissue surface of machine-pressed deciduous hardwood fibers to emulsify their mirror-finished smooth cerebrum into a blood and CSF neural suspension and make them drink it with a bottle of Coley. Since they weren't fucking using it to think, they might as well shit their brains out. There's no room left for debate. The climate is changing. Anyone who claims otherwise can't be trusted with the responsibility of decision-making. Yeah. Okay, so the IPCC reports are a little dense. Like I said, 2,400 pages, 14,000 studies. It's a textbook that makes your textbooks look like middle school handouts. It can be especially intimidating to those of you who just learned a bunch of new words about science. A better alternative for the layman who wants to learn about the climate crisis is The Climate Book by Greta Thunberg. It's not actually written by her, not most of it. You might think it's an impossible task. Secure a safe future for life on Earth at a scale and speed never seen against all odds. There is hope, but only if we listen to the science before it's too late. In The Climate Book, Greta Thunberg has gathered the wisdom of over 100 experts, geophysicists, oceanographers, meteorologists, engineers, economists, and mathematicians, historians, philosophers, and indigenous leaders, to equip us all with the knowledge we need to combat the climate disaster. Alongside them, she shares her own stories of demonstrating and covering greenwashing around the world, revealing how much we have been kept in the dark. This is one of our biggest challenges, she shows, but also our greatest source of hope. Once we are given the full picture, how can we not act? And if a school child strike could ignite a global protest, what could we do collectively if we tried? We're alive at the most decisive time in human history. Together, we can do the seemingly impossible. But it has to be us, and it has to be now. You should read it. It's a good book. Obviously, it introduces the reader to the basics of the climate crisis, but it also goes much further than that, helping the reader to understand that the nature of the issue is complex. It's a complex system. So, although the solution, in the broadest sense, is simple, reduce global emissions to net zero by transitioning the world economy off of fossil fuels, the means needed to achieve it are multifaceted and nuanced. A vulnerability taken advantage of in climate disinformation campaigns that aim to exhaust the target audience out of the will to engage and then offering them simple alternatives such as do nothing or yell at Greta. Honestly, this should be standard curriculum. Everyone should read this. You should read this. This is the greatest threat humanity has ever faced, short of nuclear. So, let's finally get to it. In case you didn't already know, a quick summary on the climate crisis is that we're burning coal and burping cow, releasing incomprehensible quantities of gases into the atmosphere, very slightly changing its composition, which wouldn't be an issue except for the fact that the vast majority of our atmosphere is transparent to infrared light, and these gases aren't. Mostly it's CO2, but methane is also an issue, sometimes going by the name natural gas as a transparently malicious marketing scheme to try to trick you into thinking that it's somehow good, since they're not transparent to IR. And we're dumping so much of it into our skies so fast, it's making the atmosphere more opaque. We're progressively darkening our clothes and absorbing more heat from the sun we otherwise would have been reflecting back into space. The book also talks about the role CO2 plays in regulating the atmosphere and more generally in exchange with life as a whole. Specifically, since plants use carbon to build their bodies, same as everyone else I guess, but the waste product is oxygen rather than CO2, which they expel as soon as they can, meaning that when a plant dies, like a really big tree, it sucked a ton of CO2 out of the atmosphere, kept the carbon, and spit out the oxygen right away. So if for some reason it's buried rather than decomposed, that carbon can be stored for right up until a monkey's cousin decides it wants to harness the power of microexplosions to spin magnets so the sand it tricked into doing math can mine some degenerate meme coin left over from one of that Squid Game YouTubers pump and dump schemes. We really live in the best timeline. It talks about the connection between human civilization and species extinction. Actually, I have a whole book on that I'm reading right now. Oh, it's written by the same person. There's another part about tipping points. Like, for example, there's tons of methane. Oh, I'm sorry. Natural gas. Frozen in Siberian permafrost that's currently melting. Since methane is much more potent a greenhouse gas, we're emitting less of it and it degrades after like a decade or so in the atmosphere back into CO2. So if it were to melt, it may be an unrecoverable tipping point, a positive feedback loop. Positive meaning reinforcing the phenomena rather than regulating it. You've been paying attention, right? that sets off unrecoverable warming that causes even more rapid and catastrophic change. There's also a concept called the carbon budget, the amount of CO2 we can still emit into the atmosphere before we lock ourselves into crossing certain thresholds, usually 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C, global average rise above pre-industrial global average, each which represent certain likelihoods of triggering one of those tipping points. By the way, in case you're wondering, the moment Spray Tan Satan took office in the United States last month, climate scientists considered it inevitable that we'll cross 1.5 degrees C, meaning we're already facing the likelihood of triggering tipping points, but at least we removed pronouns from government emails. Go team! There's a lot more, and I can really just read the book. Humans, in all our diversity and individuality, really aren't all that different. Given the same information, most people would end up at some of the same few conclusions. Don't believe me? Think of a random card fast. Now pick something other than the Ace of Spades. Not the Queen of Hearts either. I bet it was the Seven of Diamonds. Yeah, you think you're so fucking smart. Oh, I'll think of a really random one this time. Fuck you. You're just a bumpy sack of human juice, same as everyone else. On the same wet rock falling around the same ball of fire. That was a neat trick though, huh? If it didn't work on you, just shut up. So, if we're so united in disposition, why haven't we solved the problem yet? Introducing our villains. I gotta make this fast because I'm writing this on the 25th and recording it on the 27th. The February episode might be a day or two late, and if it is, I want you to blame these mother pheasant plucking rock hucker tons of ditches. I've been cursing too much, and I'm worried about how YouTube's gonna do me for this one, so I've made some minor syllabic adjustments. I listened to season 1 of the podcast Drilled, which talks about how the fossil fuel industry reacted to the growing consensus of the climate. If you want to, I don't even know how to contextualize this. What they did makes what the tobacco industry did look like some Swiftie-inspired amateur hour aspiring Nepo baby with no voice coach cracking her way through the karaoke mix of I Will Survive on a dusty, dimly lit stage, next to the full pyrotechnics of Taylor herself lip-syncing the song of carefully crafted PR-advised brand image and industry manipulation, blasting so hard the shockwaves whip the pavement down the block like a Roadrunner bit to the packed stadium of adoring fans who really think she's like their friend or whatever, a feminist icon, voice of a generation. You gotta listen to this, at least season 1. And there's an important lesson behind this that I'm getting at. In short, the greenhouse effect was theorized sometime in the 1800s. In the 70s, Exxon wanted to make what they called the Bell Labs of energy. They were even funding climate research, and through that were some of the first to see the effects in action. And then in maybe the 80s, they switched their plan from diversified investment in renewables and other energy forms and shifted focus down to just dinosaur juice. Obviously, this was a problem. They had just done research proving that the emissions of CO2 driven by fossil fuel use was driving a change in the climate. So what did they do? They lied their glasses off. They launched what might be the most massive undertaking of global gaslighting the world has ever seen. They invented new ways of lying. They created the template for modern PR campaigns. They leveraged op-eds thinly disguised as independent opinions published in newspapers that failed to mention the content was sponsored by the very companies the opinions are carefully crafted to protect. They hired scientists willing to sacrifice their reputation and compromise their morals to spout straight-up lies about the nature of climate science, and then leveraged it against real climate science, convincing reporters who didn't know any better to report those lies next to actual climate science as if there were legitimate differences of opinion, rather than, again, straight up lies. They designed oil and coal friendly propaganda as if they were educational content and had that shit handed out to school children. They launched a smear campaign where they combed through the emails of climate scientists and communicators and manufactured controversy by purposefully taking their offhand remarks made in private out of context and accused them of being engaged in conspiracy to mislead the public for profit, while themselves literally engaged in a conspiracy to mislead the public for profit. And then they took advantage of the nature of science communication as a whole. The reason I opened with a section describing the scientific process is because people don't really understand science that well. Remember when I said scientific knowledge is a living body of theory and experimental data? Scrutiny is at the heart of science. Scientists don't generally speak with certainty because it's by nature unscientific to treat any conclusion as if it's certain, rather than as if it's been made likely or proven reliable through experimentation. And they know that because, again, they proved the climate was changing. They literally did the science. So they abused a form of human bias by hiring trained communicators to sound really confident while telling lies that relieve the listener from the responsibility of engaging in critical thinking. If scrutiny is at the heart of science, Get out of thinking free passes are at the heart of corporate-sponsored conservatism. They thrive off of crafting calculated lies designed to tell listeners that what they already believe is true, and that no action other than protecting the status quo is required of them. And it's easier to believe. It's harder to apply critical thinking skills than it is to allow bias to guide you. It's harder to think than it is to choose not to. We gotta talk about conservatism in another episode. So, if you've been paying attention, this episode and last, and you've happened to pause the video a few times to digest, I know, I'm sorry, I talk fast a lot, then you might have seen the dots start to connect. Misinformation is designed to excuse you from engaging in critical thinking. Last episode I said democracy depends on access to education and information, and that it's your responsibility to be an active participant in society. Specifically because that's what makes democracy work, and that's what makes it good, and starved of those things, a democracy would fail. So, in a larger context, zooming out beyond just the Jurassic Juice distributors, what happens to a democracy when their educational systems are handing out corporate-made propaganda, where regulatory decisions are being designed by politicians whose re-election depends on receiving funding from the companies they regulate, where carefully calibrated corporate propaganda is presented in the news next to real science as if what's true is a decision for the viewers, where infotainment news reaffirms the user's intellectual laziness, insisting that they never need to change their minds or allow their opinions to be challenged, and that the only participation in society they need to engage in is an affirmation of the status quo. What happens to a democracy without access to education and information? Without active participation? It dies. The elephant in the room. American democracy is dying. And this is why. Big money's influence over the political process siphoned power away from citizens and into the hands of big donors. Fewer people were required to gain and maintain power, and now we're seeing institutions being dismantled, sycophantic loyalists replacing positions in government, decision-making power being redirected to the president, roadblocks to power being removed, unelected officials wielding the power to dismiss dissenting voices. Next episode. Back to Exxon. These smother snuckers need to be hit with a RICO case. They committed crimes against humanity. They already publicly admitted to gaslighting the public. Criminal is an understatement. And they're still doing it! I picked the wrong section to stop swearing. All this was talked about just in Season 1. Listen to Drill, it's really good. There's an important lesson in all this. There's no acceptable form of protest against oppression according to the oppressors. More broadly, you can't win by playing by the rules when the person you're playing against is making up the rules and then breaking them when it's convenient. Listen to the progression of climate disinformation. Climate isn't real. And if it is real, it's not as bad as they say. And if it is, it's not actually that big of a deal. And if it is, it's not our fault. It's China's fault. And if it is, it was an accident and we didn't know any better. And if we did, it's because God put the oil in the ground for us to burn. And anyway, it's not real. That's the narcissist's prayer. There's no winning an argument with a manipulator. You win by not arguing with them. You strip them of their power over you. They cry about fairness while breaking the rules. Fairness is a social contract that they violated. The terms no longer apply to them. So what now? Advocating for the Environment by Susan B. Inches. Susan Binches. It's Susan Binge, an accessible, solutions-oriented guide for addressing the Earth's environmental crisis and enacting meaningful change. I'm losing my voice. I gotta take a break for a minute. I drank some water. I got some blueberries. I got a neck pillow. Things are going good. What can we as ordinary citizens do about climate change? While countless environmental books focus on the causes of our current crisis, like the climate book, Advocating for the Environment is one of the first to focus on advocacy and policy-based solutions, arming readers with the tools they need to take action and enact change. In Part 1, environmental policy expert Susan Inches, they didn't put the B in that time, so I couldn't do it again, discusses storytelling, empathy, mindset, and how effective communication can help us collaborate with others, even those with opposing views. Part 2 focuses on practical skills like coalition building, media relations, communication strategy, and navigating political and bureaucratic obstacles that block large-scale legislation. The book also includes case studies, research, and templates to deepen learning. Professors and teachers, legislators, community leaders, students, environmental clubs, and church groups will find useful ideas and strategies on every page. I bet you could guess what I'm about to say. I think you should read the book. These two books form a kind of synergistic pair. If you want to get started down the path of climate activism, read the climate book and then advocating for the environment. And then, keep reading more books, because the journey of expanding your mind stops at death, and no matter how smart you get, you'll never be excused from the responsibility of actively seeking new knowledge. This book holds a lot of useful knowledge, so instead of giving you a rushed breakdown of it, I'm going to list some of the important ideas it touches on, and save the more detailed analysis of it for a future episode. I already rush drilled, and I don't want to make any more sacrifices to meet the deadline of... It's the 27th right now. Tomorrow. There's no way I'm going to have this edited in time. It opens with the idea of sharing your personal story in relation to the advocacy you're doing to establish your connection to the topic and help excite support through empathy. You remember that intro about how it used to snow? See, I know what I'm doing. I read the book. Now, imagine if I opened with the definition of phenomena. You'd be watching a signifier video right now. This only works if your story is seen as legitimate and authentic. Then the concept, this goes back to the previous episode where I mentioned the Dictator's Handbook. Identify the decision makers. You have to engineer your advocacy around who makes the decisions needed to implement the change you're asking for. It doesn't matter how compelling your argument is if you're delivering it to someone who just can't make the change you're asking. It divides advocacy into 4 general roles. Organizers, self-explanatorily, organize the movement. Advocates are the ones actually delivering the messages to decision makers. Supporters provide support like showing up, making calls, through funding. Disruptors take disruptive action to gather attention to the cause or stall opposition like protests. There's different forms of action that can be taken, like direct protest, lobbying, serving in public decision-making positions directly, supporting election campaigns, litigation. It calls into question the relationship between humans and nature, specifically how that relationship is imagined by society. By shifting the narrative to recognizing humanity not as above nature, but as a part of it and dependent on it as a complex system, it makes understanding how we should interact with it with more respect and nurturing more intuitive. If you're coming in, then come in. If not, then stop scratching at the door. It expands on that by talking about the strict father versus nurturing parent worldviews. The strict father worldview is more authority-based, where it's the parent's job to protect the children and discipline them in the good behavior. It's hierarchical, punishment-oriented, and helps build a narrative about the world that success requires morality. So the successful must themselves be moral. Definitely true. Don't think about it too hard. Just do what you're told. The nurturing parent worldview is based around mutual respect, empathy, and working to uplift the child to enable them to succeed. These ideas are abstracted out and guide people's understandings of how the government should function and interact with its citizens. Okay, so, side note. One of these approaches is more closely associated with abuse dynamics, while the other is associated with positive mental health outcomes in clinical studies. Can you guess which one is which? It also talks about how to work with others who don't share your worldview by focusing communication on what they value and how what you're advocating for supports those values. Which can at times be hard to do because, again, if your opposition's worldview is that the world is simple, then complex ideas don't mesh. It's harder to think than it is to not think. These worldviews just aren't equal to each other. In order to implement change, you have to devise a strategy motivated by a positive vision for the future. Positive meaning like do thing rather than prevent thing, where action acknowledges the structures of power, decision-making, and the worldview differences. Then the book describes how to manage a campaign, work with decision makers, framing, and communication. I'm just listing chapter titles at this point. We'll have to do this in more detail later. You should read the book. Now on to action. Climate Change Makers is a modern climate advocacy network built for busy, productive people. We advance systems-level, no-brainer climate solutions via strategic advocacy for policy and key electoral priorities. We advocate for federal, state, and local policies in the U.S., focusing on high-leverage, evidence-based, no-brainer climate solutions where constituent advocacy can make an impact. Our signature online resources, action playbooks, issue briefings, and hour of action, coworker sessions make productive climate advocacy approachable for everyone, from first-timers to seasoned advocates. This is where the episode has to halt. It's the 27th of February right now. There's no way I'm going to be able to get through all this material, break it down into another section, write the script, and then actually take those actions like I was planning to. I didn't have enough time. So maybe we revisit this in episode 3 or 4. For now, I joined the Climate Change Makers. You have to just make an account and then sign up for their email list. It's not a big deal. And I'll take the actions they recommend, like making phone calls, sending emails, screaming into the gaping jaws of death itself in the form of the all-consuming abyss that is American politics right now, lined with jagged dagger teeth of fascist menace, slathered in stupid sauce so potent the only form of satire still alive is just thinly veiled hate speech on internet forums swarming with euphemistic neo-Nazi rhetoric. God, Obama, why did you have to wear that tan suit? This all could have been avoided! Michelle Trachtenberg died? Donnie died? Ah.